And thank you, Jed, for your introductory remarks. There's no greater chronicler of the New Orleans story than Jed, and it's truly an honor to come after you and Mayor Fenty, who did incredible work in DC. I'm going to take it down one level to the practitioner level, talk a little bit about what we've accomplished in New Orleans, and hopefully with some humility. I'm definitely not a Bostonian, is that the correct term, or from Massachusetts, but talk about some lessons that you could maybe draw from the New Orleans experience. As Jed talked about, New Orleans went through in 2005 the worst natural disaster in our country's history. 1,000 New Orleanians died, over 80% of our city went underwater, and our most at-risk families were dispersed across the country. When you combine this with New Orleans' incredible violence, we have one of the higher murder rates in the country. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the cohort of students that went through Hurricane Katrina have probably had one of the most troubled upbringings of any cohort of students in this country's recent history. But as Jed noted, this did give us an opportunity to rethink education. And we did what you all would have done in a similar situation. We started looking across the country. We had a chance to rebuild and restructure our system. We wanted to see what was going on well. And it won't shock any of you all that in the United States, perhaps the richest country in the world, there is not one high-functioning urban school system in this country. There was not one city we could look at and say, that's what we want for our kids, because it didn't exist in this country. And we started to think about why that was. This is a very rudimentary graphic that captures our thinking at the time. We looked all across the country, and there were reforms in curriculum, there were reforms in the length of the school day, there were reforms in behavioral systems for students. And what we came away with was the idea that there's a bunch of well-meaning actors in the system. I think generally the unions actually do care about kids. I think teachers care about kids. I think the families want the best for their kids. But they're stuck in an incredibly dysfunctional system. It's a system that's regulated very poorly, the contractual relationships are awful, and the history of the system is just capturing educators and families into patterns of dysfunction. And this was our big takeaway, that if we took on reforms and what we did was change the curriculum, or change the length of the school day, or change the master's degree or retirements for teachers, that we were going to have, in 20 years, be having the same conversation. There's going to be, as Mayor Fenty noted, another PowerPoint deck about what we're going to need to do differently. But that unless we change the actual structure of the system, nothing was going to change. And so that's what we did. And when we changed the structure of the system, we handed power back. If there's one key takeaway that you can take from the New Orleans experience, I think this is it. We handed power away from a centralized bureaucracy, and we gave it to educators and parents. In New Orleans right now, educators run schools. They form nonprofit boards, and educators decide what's best for children in any given school building in the city. Second, parents choose amongst these schools. What street you're born on no longer determines where you get to send your kid to school. You can select from any school in the city. And third, public tax dollars are at stake. This is a public good, so government regulates the system for performance and equity. Now, if you were going to design a school system from scratch, might be where you'd start. Let's let educators run schools. Let's give parents the opportunity to choose amongst these schools. And let's make sure that government's holding people accountable. It's a rather intuitive approach to schooling. Right now, New Orleans is the only city in the country that follows these three principles. So the question at hand and what the pioneer at Institute asked us to look at was, did it work? As Jed noted, we've seen incredible gains post-Katrina, but it's actually very hard, as Patrick Wolf will attest to compare student bodies before and after something like Katrina. It's just not an apples-to-apples comparison when your student body changes so much. So what we did is we looked at the state, which acts as kind of a control group, and we compared the performance of New Orleans students before Katrina vis-a-vis the state to after Katrina. You'll see before the state, New Orleans is the red line here. We started at an abysmal 25% proficiency rate. From 2000 to 2005, we increased that to 35%. But at the same time, the state went up 7% from 51 to 58%, so the gap closure was only about 3 points. Whenever I see trend patterns like this, I'm basically assuming the state's making the test easier, which happens across the country, and that nothing really good is happening in the city itself. You'll see what happens after Katrina. From 2005 to 2011, New Orleans jumps up from 35% proficiency to 56% proficiency. The state only went up 8%. So we closed the gap by over 60%, from 23 percentage points to 10 percentage points. We've actually, in the last 2 years, we have more recent data, have closed it to about 3 percentage points. New Orleans will likely be the first urban city in our country's recent history to surpass its state average. That being said, Louisiana's ranked 49th in the country. We still have an incredibly long way to go. But the fact is, since Katrina, we've been achieving at about 4x the level of before Katrina when you hold the state average constant. One thing we wanted to check for in doing this analysis was, did the student body change in a way where we might wonder if the numbers were changing due to external factors and not what was happening in schools? So are students less at risk? As Jed noted, the free and reduced lunch rate has actually gone up by 6% since the storm. The student body is more impoverished in New Orleans than it was pre-Katrina. Second, and if you talk to any educator in the city, perhaps most significantly, we're facing a severe mental health crisis in the city. This was a study done by RAND right after Katrina. Nearly 40% of New Orleans citizens had probable mental illness 1 year after the storm, and half of these illnesses were classified as severe. And if you look at the bottom, when they did follow-up studies, the mental illness has not really declined in the years following after the storm, which is it's different from patterns in other natural disasters where you usually see steep declines a couple years after the storm. So not as only is our student body more at risk, it's suffering from perhaps the most severe mental health crisis that any urban city has seen in the past decade. One other factor we looked at was money. Are the schools getting more money? This is a little harder to tease out because of the amount of money that came in for post-Katrina rebuilding on the facility side, less on the schooling side. If you look at 2002, you can see the New Orleans per pupil and the state per pupil were roughly the same, with the state getting about $300 per kid. That amount has gone up significantly in both New Orleans and the state since 2009. But what we did here is we broke out, the New Orleans per pupil went up to $13,000, which included recovery costs. If you actually look at how much Recovery School District charter schools are spending, they don't hold the facility costs, so that's just all the instructional costs. You get a more accurate picture of the regular per pupil ed. That's at $10,700, which is roughly the same in the states. So about 10 years ago, the state had about a $300 edge in spending, and we've roughly equalized that. So we have seen a minor uptick in spending vis-a-vis the state, but roughly the same amounts. So when you put it all together and looking at Katrina, educational performance before and after Katrina, we have a higher percentage of students with free and reduced lunch. Our citizens are suffering from severe mental health crisis. We have no major shifts in city-state funding ratios. And New Orleans is closing the gap with the state over 4 times faster than pre-storm. The New Orleans system is undeniably significantly better than it was pre-Katrina. Why did this happen? Did it happen because of charter schools? Or another way to say it, did it happen because we handed power back to educators and let them run their own schools? Jim talked earlier about the research out of Credo, which is one of the most rigorous ways of looking at charter school performance. In the paper, we go into a little more detail, but this is the headlines. Credo just came out with their study of New Orleans charters. You'll see on the left, URL's left-hand side, a 0.12 effect size in reading and a 0.14 effect size in math. Credo does something very thoughtful. They take the statistical terms and they translate it into days of learning, which is about an extra 80 to 90 days of learning a year if you attend a New Orleans charter school, which translates into about 5 more months of learning. So what New Orleans charter schools are able to educate students in 12 months, it would take 17 months of the traditional system to give the same amount of education. And this is happening now when we're at 90% charter market share. So the idea that the charter schools are creaming or only taking the kids whose families have the most energy or the most savvy is just no longer the case in New Orleans. At best, we're serving the top 90% of kids in the city, and that's very soon going to be 100% of the kids. So we've maintained these dramatic effects with a high percentage of market share. And very quickly, before I hand it over to Patrick with recommendations for Massachusetts. And again, this is your all's community, your all's city, your all's state. I give any recommendations very softly, knowing that you all know what's best for your students more so than us, but hopefully we can be of some use. The first thing I would think about was creating a recovery school district. What the recovery school district does, at its very essence, is it breaks apart dysfunctional monopolies. It's a state-based entity that can go in and extract kids out of failing schools in districts across the state, and it allows the state to put pressure on any district that is not serving kids at the level it should be. This entity is a structural innovation, but the New Orleans reforms would not have happened without it, and it provides a long-term structural mechanism to take over schools in any part of the state and hand the power over to educators and families in those areas. I think it's one of the most innovative structural things to happen in public education, and we really couldn't have done it without this. So think deeply about some type of state takeover mechanism. I see Jeff Riley's here from Lawrence. That's a small version of this. And imagine if you had Jeff's and his teams in cities all across the state, what you'd be able to accomplish. And I'll leave on a note in Boston. There aren't many cities that I could go to and be able to end a speech like I'll be able to end it here, and thinking about what the future of Boston public schools could be. New Orleans, as I said, we're achieving about 5 months more of extra learning in charter schools a year. As Jim noted, the numbers in Boston are simply phenomenal. Over 12 months of extra learning a year right now. You all simply have the highest performing charter sector in the nation. I've never seen anything like it, and I'm slightly jealous. I would die for a charter sector that looked like this. And you all are what we are fighting for in a very real way in terms of charter quality. Boston could be the highest performing urban school district in the country if it would only simply continue handing power back to educators and families. You have the strongest charter market in the country, and if you just let that market expand, highly, highly confident that you would have the best urban school district in the country. Again, there are very few cities that you could go and say this to, because most people don't have the quality of charters that you all have built up over 20 years. Very simple math here. Though it's very hard to actually get numbers on any school system in the country. From what I could tell, at least according to Wikipedia, about 135 schools right now with a current cap at 18%. I find this easier to think about in terms of schools. So let's say you're roughly going to allow 25 schools out of that 135 to become charters. If you all just set a simple goal and say, we didn't have a storm, we're not going to do this overnight, what would slow, gradual change look like in our community? Once you said you tried to grow the charter school market by 5% market share every year, that would be opening up 7 schools a year. With the high quality level of CMOs you have in the city, Uncommon Schools, KIPP, Excel, Brook, it would not be hard at all for those CMOs, plus some new startups, to be opening up 7 schools a year, every year. Fast forward to what that would look like in 10 years. You would be at 68% charter market share and 32% district share. As Jed noted, we actually left the higher performing schools under the Orleans Parish School Board. From everything I've read, the top third of Boston schools, public schools, are actually really good, and probably no need to act on those. Imagine if your system 10 years from now was the top third of traditional public schools in the city, and then those schools that are currently getting an extra year of learning, instead of being 10%, they were 70%. With slow, gradual, consistent change, you could transform Boston Public Schools and make it the highest performing school district in the country. Obviously, there's a ton of politics between here and there, but I will leave that up to you. But I'm highly confident that if you give educators the power, they can get it done, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.